Welcome to the plenary panel here from our by our family committee. It's called Creating Cohesion in the Chaos, featuring Pat Wright, Cindy Peterson-Dana, and Georgia Bettina Martin are going to share their experiences. I'm going to introduce them all now. We have Georgia Bettina Martin, who's a physician and has 2 adult children, including a son who struggles, and she's also the daughter of immigrants. She works as a community family practice physician. We have Cindy Peterson-Dana, who is a licensed mental health counselor who's worked as a dialogic therapist, trainer, and manager, as well as an advocate for non-coercive approaches. She's internationally certified in dialogic training and practice and identifies as a family member and expert by experience. And last, we have Pat Wright, who's a master's in education, who has been both energized and challenged in being an advocate for family voices for several decades. She loves learning and honoring those with unique experiences in their families. So our panelists are going to engage in a dialogue for a little bit. And I'm going to turn it over from there. If any questions come up, you can put them in the chat. Or raise your hand at some point and we will get back to you. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn it over now.
Good morning, everybody. Well, it's still morning. I'm in Minneapolis. It's probably afternoon for a lot of you. Yeah, so I'm Pat Wright, and I just want to say beforehand, well, thanks just for introducing us and whatnot. And I'm so happy to be here amongst my people. Yes, go ahead, as just mentioned, and you can put any kind of comments or questions in the chat, and we'll be giving you an opportunity to reflect a little bit later. How I got here today, briefly. It's not brief though. I'll do the best that I can. I had a sister that when I was growing up, she was younger than I was. She was very, she was in and out of hospitals for, most of her life. And so I was part of the disability community in the early 90s when I got really sick. So for several years, I just embraced, I just have to take a minute to say, I've been listening to a lot of ISPS talks, and I get really intimidated sometimes because I feel like I'm surrounded by people with all sorts of academic initials and, backgrounds and credibility and whatnot. And so I just have to take a deep breath and just relax and, be who I am here. So thanks. We all have our worth, right? And our gifts. So just to bring it to a close here so that we can move into the panel. It was important for me when my son got diagnosed in 2009 with psychosis and hospitalized that I find alternative ways of handling for at least me understanding the situation. He gets to decide what he wants to do about it all, obviously. And so that's how I got here in a nutshell. I wrote a letter to ISPS when I found out about them into the newsletter saying, hey, what about families? Where are they? That's what I need. I need to find my people. And somebody reached out and said, oh, do you want to offer a session? And so I said, well, sure, okay, somebody's got to do it. So that was at the New York 2015 International Conference, and that's where I met Cindy, actually. And it's been good getting to know her over the years. I also met Bettina a few years ago at a ISPS conference, and we've been in touch. That's one of my favorite things about ISPS and being involved in this work is all the wonderful people I've gotten to know that have been so helpful over time. I just will close for this introductory part and say that Tanya Frank is really disappointed. She's unable to be here with us today. I was hoping that she could talk about her book that's called, she just finished it, Zigzag Boy, Motherhood, Madness, and Letting Go. And hopefully you can find that soon. All right, thanks. Take it away, Cindy or Bettina.
Sure. Thank you, Pat. I want to say I feel just extremely fortunate to be here with my panel members and with all of you that are here today. I remember learning about ISPS. It's been around 20 years ago. Kermit Cole invited me to an event in New York City, and I do remember Anne Louise Silver was there, and I felt immediately among my people. And so that's, been delightful to be a part of any of these events, all of these events. I've kind of come to this work over many, many decades of my life. I have worked in the field around 35 years as a therapist, a manager for community-based services, mostly in the New York City area, although I'm originally from St. Louis, from the Midwest. It's where I got my start. And I'm also, I learned about open dialogue from Dan Mackler presenting back in 2010 about having visited Finland and really seen these great outcomes and heard about this new approach. So that really piqued my interest and have since really embraced that way of working and gotten some formal training and feel very fortunate to have learned about open dialogue. There's many other alternatives that have really influenced me. And one of them is, the peer movement, the lived experience survivor movement. Back before I had any professional, training or education, I actually, as a teenager and young adult, was hospitalized a couple times for mental health issues. And while they were never technically psychosis, they were pretty serious at the time. And I remember being very confused by those experiences. I knew that there were things happening in my life, in my context, in my family. But when I went into the hospital, everything was about symptoms and me and an illness. And I remember hearing the psychiatrist tell my parents, your daughter's not going to be able to go to school, go to college. And, you really just need to lower your expectations. She's got a disease, a chemical imbalance. And I was confused. And I'm thankful looking back that my parents didn't just accept that. And I was able to actually find alternative ways to, I'm going to say, kind of escape traditional services. One of them was actually spending 4 months up in Iowa on my aunt and uncle's farm. They were Swedish immigrants and very much like healing homes. They put me to work and didn't treat me like somebody different than anybody else. And I actually think that was more healing than anything up to that point for me. But it did, send me into curiosity and an interest in this field. So I became a therapist. I didn't talk about my lived experience for the first 10, 15 years working in the field. But I was inspired by people like Pat Deegan, Dan Fisher, Judy Chamberlain, Howie the Harp, and did eventually in the 90s start talking about my lived, and now we kind of say living experience as being such a huge part of why I chose this work. But something that really has seared my experience, my living experience, more than anything was as a mother. I have 4 young adult children, and with his full permission, I'm going to speak a bit about our experiences with one of my young adult sons. 7 years ago, he had, at the age of 19, and I already was familiar with open dialogue, but this was the most humbling experience to go through. He had what would be called an acute psychotic break. And it hit like within an hour. It's like, I'm sure it had been coming on looking back, but I was faced with, what are we going to do? And I was actually at that moment more worried about him going into traditional services than I was about, are we going to get through this? I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later in our discussion today, but we did get through it. and we used a dialogic approach, and that teacher, that has been more of a teacher for me and a humbling experience than anything else that I've been through. So I'm going to stop at this point, but before I do, I just wanted to ask everybody here with us today to kind of reflect on several things for our discussion and dialogue. One question I always have is, how do we define family? And I've noticed as a peer that often peers aren't included in the family groups. And often professionals don't talk about being family members, and yet we're all parts of families. So I'm just curious how we define family. I'm also interested in, as we think about dialogic approaches and all these really hopeful alternatives, to also wonder about how what we're doing already might be part of a big part of the discussion of, it's not just what led to the psychosis or the extreme experience, but then what we do as a system and how that impacts people from moment one. And I know Jaco referred to several things that we do. We pathologize the problem. We often respond too late. We often go to diagnosis and drugs. So anyway, that's a big question. And then the last thing is just kind of, what is psychosis? Really, is it a permanent condition? Is it a human experience? And I would just love to kind of explore those ideas as part of our discussion today. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
All right, my turn, I guess. I am delighted and terrified to be here. Thank you for including me. So how I got here, I have a son who's got tangled up with psychiatry as a result of stuff he was going through. I'm also a family doctor and have interacted with a lot of people who have similar experiences. My son got hospitalized his first semester of college. We tapered him off medication. He got hospitalized again. Eventually, we all realized the medications weren't that helpful, but at that point, things were still out of control, and he got court-ordered to outpatient treatment, to forced injections and of antipsychotic medication. And at that point, he ran away, and we were living in Flagstaff at 7,000 feet elevation in the middle of winter. I thought he was probably dead. And I realized in the middle of the night that the most important thing to me was that he would trust me and that he would feel safe to come home. So when he did come home, the first thing the mental health clinic down the hill did was send the police to our house to bring him in for another injection. And I had, from watching crime shows as a child, I knew that they couldn't come in without a warrant, so I didn't let him in. And I called the psychiatrist and I said, if you do this, you're going to ruin your relationship with him. And she said, the relationship doesn't matter. So that was sort of like the turning point for me in like kind of where I thought I was at with that, because as a physician, I had always been like pretty open-minded. I did a fellowship in integrative medicine. We had already consulted with shamans and acupuncturists, and brought like nutrition, and like one of the things that I had to realize was that I wasn't going to fix this. One of the things I really had to learn is to just be there and listen and partner with this process. The other reason I'm here is because I mentioned once to Pat that some of my most difficult patients that I had early in my practice, the ones that were just like experiencing physical and emotional pain that was really difficult to alleviate at all. After a while, after sitting with them for like a year or so. And it emerged that what they had at the center of their suffering was a son that had a diagnosis of schizophrenia who was in the care of the state mental health system. I, like now it seems obvious, but I really started to see how incredibly stressful this is, how it affects the whole family, how those families, well, how did the son end up that way? The families are having problems in the first place, but it's like the whole construct. It's not just one person and everybody is affected. It arises out of the ground of all of us, and the solution lies in involving all of us. If you help the parents, you help the child. Everything kind of evolves together. I run into a lot of the model of the parents are just barricading themselves by force in a position of controlling the child, along with the mental health system. And that is very difficult to do and doesn't seem to go well. So for a surprising number of adults in my practice, I have come to see that the source of their stress is having a young adult child that's having this kind of struggle. And stress produces all sorts of physical manifestations. Our muscles are tighter, blood flow changes, we get more pain, we can't sleep, hormones change, digestive function goes offline, heartbeat changes, breathing changes. You can't sleep, all kinds of things dysregulate. And this is the level that needs to be touched upon for anything to get better. Maybe I'll stop with that, how I got here.
Thanks so much, Bettina and Cindy. We had another question that we were going to bring up, and then we'll be opening it up for audience participation. Is that the plan? Are we on track? The next question, and some of this we may have already, been talking about in our introductions, is what has been helpful to us, to me as a family member. And I think what has been really helpful for me was I did have a lot of, I had pretty serious health issues in terms of, stress that was going on with me and being hospitalized and having surgery on my digestive tract, kind of some of the things that we were just hearing about from Bettina. And that was before anything happened with my son. But it gave me an opportunity to really embrace my own network of healers. And I heard about alternative healers in the early 90s in a center that had opened here in Minneapolis. And so when I got to the doctors and they said, well, Mrs. Wright, here's your medication. And I had been told that I had a healer inside and would ask questions of this doctor, and they just didn't really have time for me. So I gravitated into that direction of holistic alternatives and whatnot for myself. And so when my son was hospitalized in 2009, I knew for myself that I had to find people that had found a life worth meaning after going through some of the issues. I've had some of my own shared lived experience. And actually, like Cindy, I was with a family in Ireland for a couple of months. And I think that was one of the most healing things that I had during that period when I was early 20s. So I had a support system for myself, fortunately, and then I knew that I needed to find a support system of people that would be supportive of our family, or, you know, hopefully my son. And so we did. He got an ACT team. The first couple of case managers were not a good fit for us. And then he's had one since 2010. Because I feel like she's mine as much as she is his. And we're, you know, there's a lot of trust there for, you know, between in their conversations and me in the conversation with her. And what she has been, the saving grace with her is like the doorkeeper to the rest of the systems that my son has been involved with, be it the hospital system, the court system, social security system, the benefits. So rather than me, and I know what dealing with those systems are like, there was somebody that would advocate for him in hearing what he wanted. So when he was in a, you know, the middle of quite an emotional struggle, let's call it that, a tornado, she would be able to be there with him to sort out what would be most helpful in this moment. And she could be in that with him for days and in a way that I couldn't. And I really respected that about her, and obviously my son too. So allowing my son the dignity of risk for his decisions has been very, very important. When he was in the beginning of all of this, and he was smoking some marijuana, and this case manager I was talking about talked to my son saying, well, your mom is not allowing, you know, people to smoke in her house. So if you want to continue to do that, you need to, you know, we need to find another place for you. And inside I was like, no, it's okay. It's okay. But on the other hand, it was like, I knew he needed somebody to talk that through, to own what was important for him and the consequences of that. So he did move out, which was good for everybody. And, you know, he had 12 hospitalizations over 12 years. So obviously it's kind of on the continuum where we're down here in terms of medical interventions and whatnot. Thank God in the last year and a half, he's been doing wonderful. It's just a miracle. You know, I wake up and I go, oh my gosh, how did this happen? He just got a car. He's had the same job for about a year. He's living in a place that he likes, a couple of other fellows. I think learning my own skills of emotional CPR that we heard Dan Fisher in another meeting this morning, Global Families for Dialogic Approaches, that Cindy will tell us a little bit more about. I did a friends and family of Hearing Voices Network. They have parent support groups Monday night and Thursday online, and especially the skill of curiosity. So rather than making an assumption about what was going on with my son and acting on that, to be able to learn to be curious and ask him questions about what was going on in a way that I would be interested and not judgmental, which I still work on. So lastly, healing the intrusive oppressive effects of the systems. And, you know, that as I move along, and I think all of us know this to some degree, how the systems come in to break up the family, meaning taking the individual, isolating them. Then we have the whole HIPAA thing that goes on in this country. And so parents are over here as look to be medication monitors, and the way that it's set up. And I know there's wonderful people in the mental health system, so I don't want to color everybody, but this has been the effects of things that have been going on for decades in the system. So any way that we can break through that, and if you have ideas out there in the audience, I would love to hear more. And so shall we move around with our second question and then open up for audience?
Should I go next? And then
Sure.
you can wrap it up together because you're good at that. Yeah, of course, probably a lot of the same things are helpful for me as were for Pat, right? I think the main thing is really learning to feel my own feelings and distinguish like what's my fear versus, so what's really going on here and what's just my fear, and being able to see that, that being able to regulate and stabilize myself, being able to be present, being able to listen, having curiosity. Learning to listen. So, and in order to like get there, it's been really helpful. I had a wonderful therapist. I had a wonderful Zen Sangha. I have benefited immensely from participating in the HVN family support group and just having a community of others, and from all of the work that all of you out there have done exploring this territory and mapping it out and speaking and building it and growing it and putting it out there for all of us to find that there's some alternative. And like kind of the silver lining of this whole process has been just the world opening up to greater hope and to greater comfort with my own like me being inside of me and connecting to other people, and I love being able to connect people in my clinical practice too with the comfort and freedom of new ideas and possibilities and community. In the other thing that's been really important with me and my son is focusing on like this stuff that we like doing together, stuff that's like normal and good and fun. We do a lot of hiking together. That's been amazing. That is something that it's a thread that's carried through from childhood. And it's so wonderful to get out there and get out of breath and be immersed in the beauty of nature. We've done a lot of gardening. We like to cook. We like to make stuff. We both like to do photography. So we keep returning to those things. There's a list for you. You go, Cindy.
Thank you. So I want to start by just responding to something Pat mentioned, that sometimes you describe Pat feeling intimidated by kind of all the education and experience here. And I wanted to talk a bit about kind of what family brings to the table and really the wealth of wisdom and experience that we have and want to offer. So Jessica, I'm wondering, could I have the first slide? So before we get to the first slide, it actually relates to the idea of whose voice should be at the table, who's a knower about what's happening when someone has an extreme experience. So I wanted just to talk a bit about epistemic justice and epistemic injustice, which are concepts that I've kind of in recent years become aware of and have really come to appreciate. I think we've identified a lot of areas that need attention around systemic privilege and oppression. And what I kind of love about the idea of epistemic approaches or awareness is the idea that humility is part of this process. And there's probably so many more people that have wisdom that we aren't even thinking about yet in terms of who might be a knower about what's helpful when somebody's having an extreme experience. And I would just offer that family, which I think traditionally has been separated from the person at the center of concern, who's also part of the family, really hold the wisdom of that particular social network. And often we're not included in research, in leadership, in treatment. And I think it continues to happen. Even, I'm going to say, even in dialogic circles. So I think it's just important that we keep speaking about it and coming together in all the ways we can as human beings. I think you can read the definitions. I guess what I like about epistemic justice ideas and injustice is they're both spoken and unspoken, and also related to the complex interplays of all the systems of power. That includes language. Often there's not even a language to speak about some of what we experience. And so I think that's what we're hoping to have dialogue about. Next slide. So almost a year ago, a group of us, thanks to Zoom, and this is one of the silver linings of COVID, people are gathering internationally now very easily. And so we actually organized as family members from around the world. We have family members, I think, from all continents that have been involved and are involved. And we want to invite any of you who would like to be part of Global Families to join us. We meet twice a month. We actually met this morning. Dan Fisher was our guest speaker, along with Margaret Zawiza from Scotland. We're a group of family members, and we're also therapists, trainers, people with interests in dialogic approaches. There's parts of the world where, like the United Kingdom, where they're doing a randomized trial. And then there's other parts of the world where people are just beginning to hear about open dialogue. Next slide. So I know Jaco just went through the kind of core 7 principles of open dialogue. I wanted just to bring this slide up for a couple reasons. One thing I've been actively involved in for decades is really trying to bring, all of our voices together in the conversation. And that includes people that identify as peers and survivors, family members, and professionals. So one thing that's developing now are peer-supported and peer-partnered dialogic approaches. So that's an area that I think really warrants a lot further thinking around, what is the role of living experience, all of our living experience in doing this work. I wanted to go back to what we experienced as a family, because I think it did really help me come to appreciate both what we're doing and maybe what we're doing wrong with our system of care, and also what was the most helpful. And all of these principles came into play with my son. When I knew that he was having a break, he came and said, "Mom, there's a camera there, there's a camera there. The world's been taken over, we need to escape." He felt he could fly. There was really kind of immediate risk issues. And I'm like, what do we do? And although Parachute was happening in New York City, which was a dialogic approach, we're 20 miles north of New York City, so we didn't have access to that. But I did have access to some of my friends in our movement. And I knew one of them, who was a psychiatrist, had been trained in dialogic approaches. So I reached out to a number of my friends, including her. And within 45 minutes, she returned my call. And I'm going to say, when we talk about immediate help, and I might get a little tearful here, that made all the difference. I was no longer, like we were trying to cope, and we knew there was like a lifeline. There's a group of people out there who can offer us support and help. And it was also help that I had really come to trust, having heard about open dialogue. The social network perspective, she offered a meeting within a day. So we started with a smaller meeting, and then we had a lot of meetings over the initial couple weeks. Flexibility and mobility. And I want to say this is often around just kind of meeting with the social network wherever they're at. But for us, it was also about trying to pull together the best dialogic approach we could, put together, even though we didn't have a dialogic team where I live in Rockland County. We now do, actually. But at the time, we had to work with, this person I knew who was a psychiatrist, trained in this approach, and then my son's therapist, who was a family therapist who had no idea about dialogic approaches. But he was very open. And I'm going to say sometimes when we're in any context, just working with what we can find is very, very helpful. The responsibility, psychological continuity are huge. I think the relationships between all of us, and also between the therapist and psychiatrist and peers, and that really helps support the whole process. I am going to say the tolerance of uncertainty for us was hard. I thought, I knew what open dialogue was, but when my family was going through it, I really didn't know if it was going to work. I couldn't believe the intensity of the experience. What we ended up doing was having a lot of meetings and creating a 24/7 home respite with my ex-husband, my son's father, my husband, his stepfather, and myself. So we were actually with him 24/7. And what was really interesting is in the very first meeting, he was not really talking a lot with us. He was reacting to his very extreme experience. So we were meeting in the living room, and he would come down and say something and run out of the room, come back and say something. And at one point I was talking about what I thought was going on that I was worried about. I was worried about him shouting in the street at the neighbors to stop filming him. And he ran in the room and he says, "You're worried they're going to think, I've went crazy." And I said, "I am worried about that." And he said, "Well, that's not what's happening. They don't understand." And I said, "I agree with you." And as a result of our conversation that day, he agreed to stay with one of his parents and not go outside on his own, just as a way for us to help explain that there were other ways to explain what he was doing. So it was a baby step, but it was a step that allowed us to manage the situation for that afternoon. And those kind of steps continued. And 2 weeks into the process, we started to hear voices that were questioning what his extreme experience was. And at one point he said, "Mom, are you sure the world hasn't been taken over?" And I said, and he mentioned the NSA. He had reacted to an Edward Snowden video. And I said, "Well, I think they do watch all of us, but I said, I don't think we're being watched more than anybody else." And he said, "Well, if that's the case, I've been really paranoid." Now, we didn't use that word. We used his words for the experience. And he said, "I've been really paranoid for these last 2 weeks." And what he has described since then, he's never been hospitalized, and he's never had an acute psychosis like this since that time. But he said there were many voices in his head. There was an inner polyphony. And there were voices that were very strong in his, what would be called psychosis. And there were also voices questioning it. And when we had the social network meetings where we all just shared our perspectives and thoughts, he also heard our voices. And he said that even though he went through a period where he didn't trust that I was his mother, but then he would also think maybe, that's not true, that she is my mom and she cares about me. And he would listen. And he said that all of those conversations actually helped him reconnect with more of a consensual reality. So it's what's fascinating is he was not medicated through this other than 3 nights of Klonopin to help him slow down and sleep. He hadn't been sleeping before the episode started. So things like sleep, I think, are just so critical. But it was really, I mean, we must have had 20 meetings in 2 weeks. And this approach helped him kind of rejoin our family and then move on to next steps. I'm going to just mention one other moment. I know we're probably running short of time. There were moments where he was what would be called very psychotic. He was talking to the TV. He thought he saw his friends and family on TV and that they were talking to him. And he turned around and his dad and myself and his 14-year-old sister were in the room. And he said very clearly, he said, you know what this is all about? This is about me being afraid that I won't make it in this world when you and dad aren't around anymore. And his sister, who'd been part of this process, said, you know, we're going to have each other. And, you know, we're going to be there for each other. And his dad and I both said, we hear you. And, you know, we're not planning on going anywhere anytime soon. But those kind of moments, it was like an island of clarity, really started to happen more and more frequently until he came through the altered state. And anyway, since that time, there's been, we look at kind of emotional states as like the weather, that there's stormy periods, and there's also kind of sunny days and much clearer times. So we've had storms, we've had ups and downs as families, and as our family, and we've actually always moved then to social network meeting, in addition to many other things, meditation, therapy, exercise, work. My son that I'm speaking about finished college and has just started a full-time job this week after working part-time for a couple years. So life continues, and this is now over 7 years later. I'm going to say dialogic approaches really gave us a different way to talk about and understand what was happening. And, you know, I'm just so thankful to be able to be here talking about it today with all of you. And I want to go to the last slide, actually. And so we're going to share these slides, I hope. We have a survey for anybody who wants to take it, who's part of a family, around your interest in dialogic work and what kinds of services are in your part of the world. And we've translated it to 6 languages at this point, but we are open to translating it to any other languages. We want to make it fully available to all families. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Wow. Is there a way that we could put the Global Families for Dialogic Approaches, could we put that email in the chat? Or I'm just wondering, maybe at the end maybe we can give our emails, come to think of it, in the chat.
You can type them in the chat to everyone right before the end, or if you have something, I can post it in the chat. We can also have after the whole conference, have, you know, tonight, have something sent out to everybody if you like.
Okay, well, there's Cindy, and I'm going to try and multitask also. But meanwhile, catching my breath here. Let's open it up. And I know we've had some comments that are through in the chat and whatnot, and possibly, I think I saw a couple of questions anyway. So Jess, do you want to help us out with that?
We
Sure.
we also have some hands raised too, so maybe we can alternate, Jess, between the chat and people who
Sure.
are
I think 2 things. One was kind of answered, but maybe if there's something else you want to say on about suggesting support groups for parents with adult children diagnosed with schizophrenia. I think you've really talked about all the different types of support that you guys have gotten, but if there's anything else you want to say. And the other questions, I clarified one on the chat, just some things you were talking about, but I'll clarify it here also. the HVN approach. So that's Hearing Voices Network. I put a link to the Hearing Voices USA and InnerVoice Online and their approach, and also some questions about sort of the dialogic approach and if there's anything, how people can get more in contact with people doing that kind of work in their area. So those are the general questions so far. If any of you want to comment on, support groups or the HEV, how to get in contact with HVN and dialogic approaches, that would be great.
Well, maybe I'll just say one thing about, so HVN has the training programs that they do for HVN facilitators. And they have started adding groups for family and friends. The first one was in early 2020 before all the chaos hit. And so I would suggest getting a hold of Wildflower Alliance about the family and friends training, because that's who does that. Does anybody else have anything to add in terms of, well, maybe I'll just throw out there too, there recently was a Soteria Summit. Some of you probably have heard about that. And that was several sessions and it was global, introducing to those who hadn't heard, but Soteria started in the 70s in San Jose, California. Boyce Hendricks was a co-founder. And now people all over the world, in Israel and whatnot, are opening these up. And so the Soteria Summit, I think if you just put that in Soteria Summit and Google that, you will find that group. So they are going to be continuing to meet, and those are people that, are very, very active in that area, which also encompasses, we have breakout groups, and it encompasses the being with, if we're going to call it that, kind of philosophy where we're going to be with people as opposed to, the systems that have power over, or, like we're all equal. And okay, so let's move along. What else do we have, Jess? Or should we take a hand?
Yeah, I have a few hands. Maybe Raji, you can go first. If you want to unmute yourself, Raji.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful panel and for all of the new resources that I was not familiar with. I'm a social worker, and my heart is with everyone in all communities. But I think maybe at this moment, I'm shining light on basically the criminal justice system that I work in, as well as the community mental health. But I'm thinking about, as you talk about resources and support networks and what it took in the dialogic process, the open dialogic process, what I meet with time and again with clients is dehumanization and criminalization of race and poverty, and the complete structural inequity of access to of resources and humanization. I mean, what they get goes back to Pat's point that's been brought up, having to do with what do we do as a system or systems? What do the various systems do to complete that phrase, to make matters worse, right? And so I just wonder, a lot of these things sound great to me, and I'm not meaning it in a sarcastic way, in actually a positive way, but I do not know how. Part of me kind of goes around wanting to be this person who can be the bridge to bringing some of this to the most impoverished and catastrophically traumatized people and communities. Because a lot of this resides often, I don't know about this one, but at least in your traditional psychiatric model, anything such as therapy often resides in the private practice world. And so how to bring it to communities, if there's some resources, suggestions, because right now all they get is medicated. They're numb. The only option is for them to numb themselves out and to sort of flit between jails and prisons and psychiatric inpatient wards. So if there's the panelists are able to share there.
I just want to advocate for Wildflower Alliance, because a lot of the people that are they've only recently started to really interact with families. Fundamentally, it's an them and created and found a way through. And there's a lot of, it's hard. Yeah, but it's possible.
I just want to jump in that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, but some of it has been done. There's been bits and pieces around the world. In Westchester, the previous agency where I worked, we actually worked in the Westchester jail, and we would try to create social network meetings as a way to discuss, what the situation was and what steps forward might be helpful. And I know there's this huge Odessa trial in the United Kingdom where they are looking at a randomized approach to researching peer-supported open dialogue compared to treatment as usual. And from what I'm hearing, they're having very positive results and initial outcomes. So I think some of this is happening in the public system. And I think the more awareness there is, I'm hoping the more of a demand there is. I think family groups have a lot of power if we get organized and use it, as well as all of the other groups. So that's
also, individuals such as yourself are incredibly important. Like you are a bridge, right? You are a bridge. We have an amazing public defender here because my son has been through a lot of interaction with the criminal justice system as well. And we have an amazing public defender with an amazing social worker who is just fighting the good fight, and they do a lot of good. But yeah, a lot of work ahead of us.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry, yeah.
No, that's okay. Yeah, a lot of good things said here. And I want to reiterate what Bettina was saying, that your being in relationship with these individuals is humanizing for them, even if it doesn't go beyond that. And a lot of work needs to be done. And at the same time, what can we do with what we have right now?
All wonderful responses. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the way that you didn't minimize what I was saying, which is what usually happens, or throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, this is what we have. Too bad. Let's, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Good question.
Thank you.
Ellie, you want to let the next person?
Sure. Yeah, we have another hand raised, Scott. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, Scott Norman.
Well, I just wanted to say that I grew up in a twistedly bizarre family situation. I always had strange physiological symptomatology. Bizarre but severe, and I believe my mother underwent similar, took her life. And there are times when, and I think this manifests in many people, that the problems in the body are, because not only are they painful, can they be painful or agony, not acute pain, but various bizarre agonies. They affect behavior both because they're painful, and when you're in continual agony, your behavior is going to be affected. But it's hard to express that it's one and the same, that at the same time as they are affecting your ability to control how you think and how you feel and how you behave. And I think that is at work. And where you see a lot of mental illness, you also see diets that are so bad, because the average, even people that think they're conscious about what's healthy. But again, I've made a study of that. And I warn you, I have little formal education. I have a reputation for getting on Zoom meetings and offending people. I must be doing something right. But believe me, I live this. Okay. Yeah, I run around talking to whoever listens to me, but doesn't mean I don't mean what I'm saying. or that I'm not moved by. Look, I just lost a friend that I believe had I outreached, to whom I believe if I outreached, they passed away. Apparently they took their own life. This was a couple of months, not even a month ago, actually, about a month ago. And, you know, I'm all broken up about that. And I'm broken up about the fact, I'm guilty about the fact that I didn't reach out to them because I had no inkling that this was going to happen. And I'm just trying to offer my own experiences that we do ignore the dietary factor. And I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but if you ignore it, if the body, it's not a chemical imbalance you can fix with a pill. That's it, Joe. You can only make the situation worse with outside chemicals. Because the body is natural balance. I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's okay. We just have 2 minutes left. So I think, you know, you made a lot of interesting points, and I'm sorry for, you know, what's been going on. I think that, you know, this theme of loneliness and isolation is really key. And I think it was maybe Pat who's talking about how part of what we do is just to, you know, kind of break up the family. I was struck by that term. And how our, you know, our whole system is around sort of wrenching the person from their family and from society as a whole. Really, we tend to, you know, our response tends to be, you know, let's put people away someplace where they won't bother the rest of society, rather than, you know, engaging and having a conversation. And it's hard to know that fundamentally, I think, is not really going to work. We just have like a minute left. I just want to give I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I just want to give the panelists a chance to wrap up, and if there's any last words they want to say.
I want to throw in real fast. I think it's really great to hear that Scott had some success with dietary change. There's so many different things that are helpful, and everybody, you know, like everybody has to find their own way through it, right? With the support and openness we offer each other to support that process, that, you know, that allows it to happen. No one prescription for everybody. Many tools.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Cindy, do you have final words?
I'm very humbled to be here, and I'm very grateful. And I wish we had more time, and I wish I could see everybody's faces.
Likewise.
Be there in person.
Yes, maybe next year we'll be there in person. And I just want to address, you know, Pat, and some of the anxiety about, you know, everybody with their fancy letters after their name. But I mean, I think that, you know, your experience, you have a lot to offer, and what we need to hear. And I do think that families are very powerful. And just going back to, you know, a question about support groups, you know, my goal is, I think that the main support groups out there is NAMI, and that whole, yeah, exactly, your face, that biological approach. And I think it's a great system saying unhelpful things, a huge network of unhelpful things. And I think, you know, it would be great, you know, for, you know, all the family members to have, so family members would have an alternative when they're looking for support to get and learn about other things. And I think you guys are really starting all of that. And I appreciate that. So thanks for sharing all your experiences with us today.
Thanks so much, Jess.
Okay.
Yeah, I think families are taking back their power away from the whole medical field. Yeah, to give choices.
Okay, so I think on that note, we are out of time for today.